Ever since you were a child, you were told certain things aren't real. Ghosts, angels, demons, vampires, werewolves. The monster under your bed, the one in your closet. It's a comforting thing we've all been told all of our lives. But what do you do when you find out that the monster under the bed isn't so imaginary? What do you do when you find the devil is real? Sometimes people find these things out, and that's when they come to me. Join me, Kevin Mears, demonologist, for a look at the paranormal on my new YouTube video, Paranormal Encyclopedia. We're going to be talking about the things that go bump in the night and why sometimes there really are such things. Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I'm still your host, Kevin Mears. So, keeping with the Halloween theme, I've been wanting to do a lot of monster episodes. I was originally going to do an episode on zombies. Everybody likes zombies, right? Well, actually I don't, but we'll get to that. But then I thought about it, it's like, if I'm going to properly talk about zombies, I need to take it back a step. So, I'm going to be talking about voodoo, I'm going to talk about voodoo dolls, I'm going to be talking about hoodoo, and I'm going to talk about zombies and where they all fit in. So, voodoo is a very interesting religion from a historical perspective. What makes it so unusual is it's not really one religion. For a start, I'm going to say voodoo because it's shorthand in technical terms talking about Afro-Caribbean religions. This is voodoo, Palomombe, Santeria, Macumba. There's a whole series of interrelated religions, but most of what I'm saying applies to all of them to one degree or another. So what you have is these tribal religions that originally practiced in Africa, going back thousands of years. We're talking about long before recorded history. Voodoo, or at least in its roots, is probably one of, if not the oldest religions practiced in the world, because it has its root in African tribal belief. Now what happens is voodoo, as we know, we refer to it, specifically comes from the Congo, the area known as Benin, at one time as Benin. Other related religions come from other parts of Africa. Santeria is usually associated more with West Africa, for example. But at any rate, voodoo as we know it today is a product of the slave trade. At least as it's practiced in the United States and Haiti. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about African voodoo because it's its own kettle of fish. I may even do a future episode. But basically, slavers went to Africa. They took their slaves, and they bring them to the United States. Usually starting off, Haiti, Cuba, Brazil, and then brought into the U.S. from there. And when these people were brought over, they were brought over with their original beliefs. Now, the historical beliefs was a worship of these gods, or these Loa, as they're now known in the U.S., though actually the word voodoo is originally a word for gods. But they brought their beliefs with them. Now, particularly in the United States, you had this problem in the South, particularly, of course, New Orleans, where the slave owners were becoming very concerned about these tribal beliefs. And I'll get into what those are in a bit. I want to get into the history first, just to give you an idea. Because what they were finding was that these beliefs were so widespread, and so important, and so very different from Catholicism, which was, of course, the primary religion practiced in New Orleans at the time. Particularly, they have a problem because there's a slave revolt in Haiti. And the leaders of the slave revolt were well known to be part of the voodoo religion, and all throughout the history of Haiti, there's a lot of involvement with this religion. Papa Duvalier was a practitioner. Many of the people in his secret police were practitioners. There's rumors he even used zombies. And again, we're getting into the zombie thing. There's a story to be told here, and it needs to come progressively to really understand all of its implications, in my opinion. At any rate, a lot of places in the South outlaw the practice of voodoo. So you have these people, these slaves, who want to continue their original practices, but can't do so openly. Now, the thing about most polytheistic religions, like voodoo, like the Greek pantheon, the Norse pantheon, is they tend to be kind of syncretic, is the technical term. When two tribes in anywhere in the world really fought, the losing tribe usually adopted the gods of the winning tribe, and to some extent vice versa. Because there's this logic there of, well, when we fight, our gods protect us. If our gods didn't protect us, well, their gods must be greater than our gods. So then you didn't necessarily drop your own belief, you incorporated. So what they did is they started incorporating aspects of Christianity. Different voodoo Loa were associated with the Catholic saints, to the point that the two religions have become so intermixed it's hard to separate voodoo. For voodoo practitioners, it's hard to separate the two. A particularly important figure in all of this is a woman by the name of Marie Laveau, or the Widow Paris, who's a really neat woman. She was a free black woman in New Orleans. What makes her so interesting is she wielded an enormous amount of power, particularly for a black woman in the 1800s. Part of this was because she was very smart and very clever, because she was, in fact, a hairdresser, very popular with the Creole ladies. Not to get too stereotypical, but there's this idea women talk to hairdressers. She had a lot of friends and contacts among the slaves and the servants in the different rich families, so she could collect a lot of blackmail information and use that to her advantage. She also made a lot of effort to make her religion more public. She held voodoo ceremonies in St. John's Square for the public, invited people to come, charged admission, got it out there, got people more accepting, more used to it. Although she continued to hold more private ceremonies in the bayous, the swamps, at night. And it's also actually really quite clever that originally it was started by the original Marie Laveau, so known as Widow Paris. And then when she got older, her daughter took up the title so that they could keep this mystique of this eternally young woman. She's now believed to have been buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, although there's some debate about that. But again, it's a very interesting woman, and she was very important to popularizing voodoo and making it the well-known religion that it is today. So let's talk a little bit about its beliefs. Voodoo, as it's practiced particularly in Haiti and in New Orleans, has a lot of Christian influences. There's this belief that there are all these Loa, these spirits, all of which serve a greater deity. This greater deity is similar to the idea of the Christian God, but he doesn't take that direct role in human events. That's where the Loa come in. You go to the Loa when you need help. There are a lot of different Loa, a lot of different associations. I do not want to list them all. Some of the best known ones, there's Damballa. If you ever heard of the movie The Serpent and the Rainbow, Damballa is the serpent in question. He's associated with serpents. He appears as a serpent. Very important deity, one of the primary ones, in fact. There's Ruli, who is the rainbow in the same title, who's more of a mother figure. There's Ogun, who's a lord of destruction, though not necessarily negative. There's Legba, and I'm going to talk about Legba a bit here because he's actually kind of interesting. And when I get into doing episodes on the whole idea of selling your soul to the devil, he's going to figure in with one of the famous American versions of the story, which is, of course, the Robert Johnson legend. But Legba's a god of the crossroads. He's associated with the Getty, which are the spirits of the dead. I'm going to touch on that again real quick. The other major figure I want to talk about is Baron Samedi. The Baron's a really interesting figure. He tends to dress like an undertaker, the top hat, tails, except he has a face of a skull. He's a god of magic. He's a god of the graveyard. He's a god of the spirits of the dead. He's the leader of the Getty. There's a couple other related spirits that all get associated there. He's also known as Baron Saturday. What I always find very interesting about him is while he's a very dark figure, I mean, he's a grinning skull, and he's a spirit god of the dead. He's also a party deity. He smokes tobacco. He drinks rum, and so some of the things that make voodoo unusual and interesting. One is you have this idea of the Gedi. Gedi are spirits of the dead. In voodoo, you have generally two broad categories of Loa. You have the Loa like Dambala, Ogun, they're associated with forces of nature, and then you have ones that are great leaders of tribes, great historical figures, great warriors, chieftains, things like that can also become worshipped as a Loa, usually more locally within a specific tribe, which are where these Gedi I'm talking about come in. What's also really unusual about Loa, and you don't see it in most other well-known religions, although you find it in some forms of shamanism, is your relationship with the Loa in voodoo is very active. It's not like the Catholic saints where you pray to them. They actually come here. And I'm going to get to that when we get back. Okay, so what makes voodoo a very unusual religion to Western sympathy, normal Western ideas, is this idea of being ridden. Now, during a voodoo ceremony, practitioners are actually believed to be taken over, possessed, if you will, by the Loa. The Loa then communicates with the worshippers. Each Loa has different things associated with it, like, for example, when I talked about the Baron, his fondness for tobacco and rum, it's not just that he thought to sit up in the spirit world smoking a cigar. When he takes over a person's body, he asks for tobacco, he asks for rum. Each of the different Loa have specific things they ask for, they have specific mannerisms they take on, and it's interesting that you can go from one group practicing in New Orleans to another group practicing in maybe Philadelphia, and the same Loa, referred by the same name, will act the same way when it's possessing someone. I use the word possessing because as a convenience. It's not like you see in the movies with demonic possession. In voodoo, it's actually called being ridden. What makes it really different, the two big things that make it different is, one is it's not generally malevolent, and two, it's willing. This is what the practitioners expect. This is part of their religious belief. They're not trying to exorcise the spirit, it's supposed to be there. It's also these spirits that will specifically ask for sacrifice. So before I get into hoodoo, and then from there into the zombies, let's talk a little bit about sacrifice. Yes, voodoo practitioners and Santeria practitioners actually do practice animal sacrifice. Now, it's important to be clear here, we're talking about animals. We're talking about goats, cows, chicken. We're not talking about people. Are there bokors, which is a term for a practitioner of black magic and voodoo, that use human sacrifices? Yes. There's a very infamous serial killer case I'm going to talk about in a future episode. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, who led a Palomayumba cult in Mexico, who was massively tied into the drug cartel, who actually is known to have killed multiple people as part of his ritual. There's a practice that goes on in parts of Africa where they actually kill people for their body parts for different types of medicine. It's called medicine killing, which is another thing to talk about down the line, because the whole other concept, and it's really quite complicated. Normally, though, in traditional mainstream voodoo, you're talking about animal sacrifice. And the thing to realize here is it's a cultural thing. Under the mainstream rules of religion, the animal is to be killed quickly, painlessly, and the blood is to be drained. The blood is left as an offering to the god. And then you want to know what happens to the animal? They eat it. Particularly what you'll find in African tribal practices is, they'll have this ritualistic killing of an animal, and then they'll eat the animal, and we're talking about poor areas of the world. We're not talking about people that have a lot of money and a lot of food. For some of these people, this is the only major source of protein they're getting. So don't be so quick to look down your nose at it from a Western sensibility. There's a degree of similarity to other religious practices here. I don't mean any disrespect to any of the religions I'm about to point out, but Judaism has specific rules about how food is prepared. Kosher. Islam has rules about how food is supposed to be prepared. Halal. Voodoo has its own rituals about this. Again, they're not torturing the animal. Black voodoo, darker rituals that are designed to torture, to curse people and do horrible things. That's a different issue. But mainstream voodoo, the average practitioner, they're doing a ritual way of honoring their deity. It's not the dark practice people think it is. The thing to realize about voodoo, and this is really important, is there's Hollywood voodoo and there's real voodoo. And just like most things in the world, Hollywood gets a lot of it wrong. Most of it wrong, really. Don't assume what you see in the movies is accurate. Please, for heaven's sakes. So, that gives you an idea about the religious practice. Let's talk about hoodoo. Now, some of you may, if you're of my generation, I'm 39, remember a movie that came out back in the 80s called Labyrinth. Great movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But in Labyrinth, there's a song, Dance Magic Dance, and it has a sequence in it. It reminded me of the Babe. What Babe? The Babe with the power. What power? The power of voodoo. Hoodoo? You do. Here's the thing. The worship of the Loa, being written by them, that's voodoo. The voodoo dolls, the curses, the gree is hoodoo. Hoodoo is tightly related to voodoo, but one is a series of magical practices. One is a religion. Not all practitioners of voodoo practice hoodoo, and not all practitioners of hoodoo also follow the religion of voodoo. There are even some Catholics who practice hoodoo. And much like, as I said, voodoo's a combination of religions, particularly various tribal religions and Christianity, particularly Catholicism. Hoodoo's a mix of of magical practices. Some of it comes from Africa, some of it comes from Europe. So before I hit the zombies, which was the original point of this video, let's talk about the other infamous thing about voodoo, the voodoo doll. Voodoo dolls are really interesting, mostly in how very wrong most people are about them. So you have this doll that you stick pins in, and everybody knows, you use nail clippings of the person, you stick the pins in the person, and you torture the person. You cause the person to die. You stick pins in the back, and they get horrible back pain. That does happen, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But that's not the original purpose of the dolls in African magic. In the original African magic, you have this doll that represents a person. Now, different places on the doll represent different aspects of the person's life. Now, there's a spot for money problems, there's a spot for health problems, there's a spot for family problems. You stick a pin with a note on it about the particular person's particular problems into the proper spot to help them. It's not a curse. It's originally meant to be a way to help people. Now, the voodoo doll, as we think of it, is more properly called a puppet. Puppets are actually Western European witchcraft. Make a doll in the shape of a person, you include part of them, nail clippings, hair, things of that nature, and then use what's called symbolic magic. And symbolic magic uses a symbol of something to affect that thing. By affecting the doll, you affect the person by placing a curse on them. This is a very real, very dangerous form of magic. It is practiced by people who practice hoodoo. It is practiced by witches. And remember the segment we already did with my friend Drew about the history of the witch trials. When I say witch here, I don't mean Wiccans. I mean people who practice black magic, specific types of European black magic. So if you're a Wiccan, don't try not. I'm not trying to offend you. I'm using the term which, in a historical context, here in the context that people out there still use it, not exclusively to refer to you as Wiccans. I'm gonna release I'm gonna say it now. I'm going to stop making these apologies soon in these videos, not because I don't mean them, but because it takes up a lot of time if I have to constantly explain, well, I don't mean, and I think everyone watching these should be reasonably adult enough to understand what I'm talking about. I don't mean to offend people, but on the other hand, if I have to backtrack every 5 minutes and explain, well, I mean this and not that, I'm never going to get anywhere. So, let's talk about what everyone wants to talk about. Zombies. Do they seek brains? Will you get infected by a bite? Find out when we come back. Welcome back. So, we're talking zombies now. Now, let's be very, very clear. What you see in the movies, Night of the Living Dead, and most other zombie flicks isn't zombies. It's not what a folklorist, what a practitioner of voodoo or demonologist would mean when we talk about a zombie. In fact, if you go back to George Romero's original script for Night of the Living Dead, he refers to them as ghouls. There's no point in the original movie. I understand it. I haven't actually seen it. I don't particularly care for the zombie genre, where they're called zombies. This is a name that got attached later. In actual voodoo practice, you primarily find zombies in Haiti. They do occur in other places. But a zombie is a person whose soul has been taken out through magical practice. A bokor, again, like I said earlier, is the term for black magician in voodoo, uses a spell and a poison to take the soul out of the body. The body dies. The body comes back and is bound to serve that person. The whole being bitten and turned into a zombie thing, they took that from vampire folklore. You don't shoot them in the head to get rid of them. Specifically, you generally have to feed them salt. Which is why I always say, if there's ever zombie apocalypse, I'm heading out with a bunch of salt shakers and some meat, and I'm going to save the day. But that's a zombie. They are slaves. What's interesting is when you put a zombie back to rest, oftentimes in the folklore, they go back and kill whoever raised them to begin with. Now, here's the interesting thing about zombies. They're real. I know. The more skeptical of you are looking at me like I just grew another head, or I should be put in a padded cell. But no. I'll give you a name to look up. Don't take my word for the things. Do your own research. I've said this before. I'll say this again. I'll keep saying this. Clairvaux Narcissa. 1960s, Clairvaux Narcissa was declared dead. 2 medical doctors in a hospital in Haiti declared him dead. One of whom had been trained in the United States. 10 years later, a man stumbles into town. Calls himself Clairvaux Narcissa. Speaks with relatives that recognize him. Shares information that only he knew. Here's the thing. Not only was this man declared dead, he was buried. Had a rather amazing story to relate. According to him, a relative of his hired a bokor to turn him into a zombie. He was killed using this poison. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Buried. dug up, dragged off to a plantation far away from where he lived so no one would recognize him, and forced to work until he finally escaped and the man died. Now, there's a theory about how this happened. There's a man by the name of Wade Davis, very interesting gentleman. He wrote the book The Serpent and the Rainbow. The movie by Wes Craven is loosely based on his true story. Davis was asked to go to Haiti to try and figure out what was going on with this supposed zombie poison. They were hoping maybe they could figure out a way to use it for medical reasons. His story is long and very interesting. I'd recommend reading the book. Bottom line, it was tied to two things. One, tetrodotoxin, which is a poison commonly found in pufferfish. Now, any of you Simpsons fans out there, or Japanese fans of Japanese culture, may know that fugu, or pufferfish, is very, very poisonous. You eat the wrong parts of the fish, it will kill you dead very quickly. What's not as well known is that every once in a while, someone who comes down with pufferfish poisoning doesn't die. They go into a catatonic state. During this state, the respiration drops, the heart rate drops, to the point that even modern medical science can't tell the person's alive. There's a famous instance that happened in Japan where two men were traveling. They had fugu together. Both of them died. One was buried, as is pretty normal when someone dies. The other one was a representative of the emperor, so he couldn't be buried. They had to wait for an official to come collect the body. 3 days after he supposedly died, the guy got up. Survived. It's Wade Davis has theorized, and there is evidence to back this up, that this poison, combined with the stinging nettles plant, which is a plant similar to thorn bushes or nettle plants in the U.S. Basically, the nettle plants act as mini hypodermic needles, which is what allows the poison to be absorbed through the skin. Because often in parts of Haiti, they aren't wearing shoes necessarily. Poison puts the person into a catatonic state. It gets so deep that in fact they can survive buried for short periods of time, not for very long. But with your respiration at that level, excuse me, it's not. You can go a little while. Often you get some brain damage, which also explains a lot of the stuff. And that's what's really going on. I've talked to other sources that have described much more outlandish and paranormal phenomenon. I'm certainly not ruling that out. I talked in the vampire video about the possibility of demonic possession of corpses, and I think that may come into play here as well. I don't have any direct experience with zombies, but like I said, I do have some first-hand accounts. This is a continuing phenomenon, whatever causes it. So again, there you go, Voodoo with Zombies. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe, share the links. Anything you can do to show us some support is always appreciated. Please look, hopefully by the end of this week, myself and my fiancée Lumia, you can find her at Lumia Presents by looking it up on YouTube, are going to be reviewing the movie The Conjuring, which is a fantastic paranormal movie. Has some really good details, and I'm going to get into that review. I'm not going to talk about it here because I don't want to spoil. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good night.